Morning. We have now a copy of the original of the Netziv, the Meromi Soda. What I found interesting is that he's not addressing the question of Reb Kibega per se. In fact, nowhere does he mention Reb Kibega. So it's very interesting that the Masifta was able to extrapolate from this Netziv an answer to Reb Kibega's kasha. And he says the following. We're going to count up from the bottom of the second paragraph, the bottom of the page, 4 lines. We're not going to go through the entire Yerushalmi quoted by Tosfos that you need an erva that's dumya le'achos ishto. Shatora osra olav v'eni surotoli v'adam. However, Eishes ish, since it's efshal garsha lafkia ha'isur, therefore it's not similar to achos isha, which is now our paradigm of an erva that patters up hatzar. So mishum hachi, therefore Tosfos in the name of Yerushalmi establishes that the erva of an Eishes ish does not patter up hatzara because she's not dumya to achos ishto. And he says the following, 4 lines up from the bottom of the second paragraph. Mishum hachi ksiv liftar saras sara. Based on this Tosfos and Tosfos's analysis of the Yerushalmi, we can derive the conclusion that we need a special limud, a special pasuk, to patter up a saras sara. And why is that? Kidei legalos she'ein lilmod tsaras tsara mitzaras mitzara atzma. Okay, that particular line depends upon something that we skipped earlier, but the main line is coming up now. Mishum the erva ein la heter. The classic case of an erva that patters up hatzara is achos isha, which is an erva she'en la het. You cannot be matir her with a get. Masha'en kein tsaras erva. Now we want to know whether tsaras erva has the same status as the erva to pater up hatzar. So, for example, if Shimon marries Leah, the sister of Reuven, and Shimon is also married, in addition to Leah, to Rivka, who's called a tsaras erva, can we derive the conclusion that Rivka now, when she, let's say, gets married to Levi, and Levi has another wife, that she has the status of an erva to pater up hatzara, who's in this case a tsaras tsara? He says, Masha Enkein, tsaras erva, this Rivka, the second wife of Shimon, Hayala Heter. Rivka herself could have a Heter. What does that mean? Im Haya Megarish HaErva. Which means that if Shimon would have divorced whom, Rabbi Osa? Leah. So I don't know if you had this, I didn't have this. Nowhere in the Masifta did I get this impression. What the Netziv is pointing out here, and I don't know how we missed it, or at least I missed it, maybe you had it, is that the status of Rivka, namely as a tsaras erva, can be removed through gerushin in event that Shimon divorces the erva, meaning his wife Leah. Rachel, Rivka at that point is no longer a tsaras erva. He says we cannot derive the halacha that Rivka patters up hatzara when she gets married to Levi together with another wife from the fact that Rivka is a tsaras erva, because Rivka's status as a tsaras erva is fundamentally different than Leah's status as an erva. Leah's status as an erva is li'olam va'ed. That's irreversible. You cannot be matir Leah to Reuven in any shape or form. That could never be removed unless Rachel dies. But there's no active Maisa that could ever permit Leah to marry Reuven, because Reuven is married to Leah's sister Rachel. So now we understand very well the status of Leah as an erva, she'en la heter. There's no way he could do an action to be matir Leah as an erva. Masha Enke, when we talk about Rivka's status as an erva, as a result of the fact that she is a tsaras erva, Rivka's status depends upon Shimon's decision. If he decides to divorce his wife Leah, then Rivka is no longer a tsaras erva. Now let's say Misa Mapeles. So if during his lifetime Shimon would deliver a divorce to his wife Leah, Rachel now would fall for Yibum to Reuven. Why? Because Rachel's status as an erva is a result of the fact that she is a tzara to Leah. If Leah is no longer in the picture because Leah received the get from Reuven, therefore Rivka is no longer tzaras erva. So her status as an erva, which is generated by her status as a tzaras erva, is reversible through a Maisa Gerushin. And therefore, Rivka, insofar as her status as an erva lends itself to a matir of get, could now never infect, so to speak, her co-isha, meaning Levi's second wife, as a tsaras erva, because tsaras erva means an erva that will always remain an erva. And the tsaras erva, the Torah was machadish, she also doesn't fall for yibum, and she's an erva, an eshesach. But her status is removable. And that means that if Shimon decides to deliver a get to his wife Leah, he reverses the status and the Isser Erva of Rivka. Rivka now forfeits her status as a Tzaras Erva. Therefore, her status is such that she cannot patter up her Tzara as an Erva, because her status as an Erva is up in the air. It is yet to be determined, as we would say. Therefore, Mishum Hachi be'inin krol lezeh bifnei atzim. We need a special pasuk to teach us that it's tzara patters up her tzara, the tzara of a tzaras error. Okay, that's the nitzid. And truth be told, I mean, if you accept the Tosus based on the Yerushalmi, it turns out to be pretty solid. I didn't have this. I was confused here because he speaks about Eishes Ach, and how you can be mater Eishes Ach with the get. I mean, that didn't make any sense because you can't be mater Eishes Ach with the get. And then he speaks about Eini Suro Tolid Biyad Habal, and then he writes Yochel Hula Tira Me Isra Eishes Ach. Again, who is he being matir and removing the Isra Eishes Ach? What he's saying is that the Tzaras Erva, meaning Rachel, meaning Rivka, he can be matir her. Al Yidei Yigarishes Erva B'Chayav. Okay, I didn't know who that Erva was, but the Erva is Leah. V'shuv lo tiyeh Sarasa Tzaras Erva. Okay. So now we go on to Reb Shimon Shkop. And remind me, did we do Reb Shimon Shkop yet? I don't think we. Remind me, maybe I forgot. I don't think we did Reb Shimon Shkop. There were two. Oh, we did one and not the second? Well, this is not the Reb Shimon Shkop that we did at the very beginning, a week ago.
No. Oh,
but on Reb Kivega, did we do a Reb Shimon Shkop? Oh, we did number one. There were two. So let's go over number one, because I don't know about you, but I could use a chazon. But you have the page, right? Okay.
That's Gimel.
That would be letter base. And the second Reb Shimon Shkop, Rabbi numeral number 2, is letter Gimel. So we're going back to the end of page base. And it's post base. At the very end, the last 2 lines. He says, Lule chidush haTorah ve'isu tzoras tzora, haisa gam hatzora atzma, chozeres lehetera, la'ach shenesra lo mitchila, v'nefila harishona, li'achar sheyibma ha'ach Hashem u'meis. He says the following: Rivka is the tzara of Leah, who is the sister of Rachel, the wife of Reuven. And he says that Rivka herself, as a tzara of Leah, would go back to her heter, to Reuven, after Levi would be Yabim Rivka. So in the structure, before we get to the logic, but the structure of Shimon Shkop is that once Levi is Miyabim Rivka, Rivka loses her status as a Tzoras Erva. And she can now fall for Yibum, again in the Hava meaning before the Pasuk, to Reuven. Why? Now we get to the logic. Lo Haisa Tzoras Erva Eitzel Ha'achar Rishon. So as far as Reuven is concerned, she was an Erva, but not as far as Levi is concerned, because Levi was not married to the sister of Rivka. Levi was not married to the sister of Rachel. Right? It was Shimon who was married to the sister of Rachel. So that Leah was never an Erva vis-a-vis Levi, and therefore Leah was never able to infect, if you use that word, or to pass on an isur of Tzoras Erva to Rivka vis-a-vis Levi, because Leah doesn't have a status of an Erva vis-a-vis Levi. And if Leah doesn't have a status of Erva, then Rivka doesn't have a status of a Tzoras Erva. So it means the status of both Leah and Hatzara Rivka is uniquely singled out to Reuven, but it doesn't apply at all in both those cases, Leah or Rivka, to Levi. Aval b'shas hanefila hashniya b'misas ha'chasheni. Now that Levi dies, Kevan di'ena tzara le'erva, Rivka is not a tzara to an erva. Why? Because with regard to Levi, she was never a tzara to an erva. Correct? I mean, that's why Levi was miyabim Rivka. The ainli osor mishum shadayin noser ba iser eshes ach machmas acharishon. You might argue that Rivka has a status of an erva of an eshes ach because she was the tzara of Leah vis-a-vis Reuven, and therefore she gained the status of a tzoras erva. The tzoras erva is now an erva of eshes ach. When Levi is miyabim Rivka, harehi nases ki eshes hasheni, meaning she becomes the wife of Levi l'chol davar. In other words, what Reb Shimon Shkop is claiming is that Levi is not asur, he's not inhibited, if you will, from marrying Rivka as the wife of his brother because of the mitzvah of Yibum. Once he marries her, then the erva of Eshes Ach within the context of Yibum is removed entirely. Upaka mimenu iser eshes acharishon li'olam. And now the status of Rivka in terms of the Erev of Eshes Ach is completely undermined. Why? Because when Levi is Miyabim Rivka, she becomes the wife of his sister. L'chol Davar. So forget about the fact that in the first Nephilah, when Shimon died, Rivka was a tzara to Leah. That's ancient history. That's wiped off the map. Because Levi was Miyabim Rivka, creating a new situation, a new reality of Eshes Ish, which undermines the erva of Eshes Ach completely, even if in the first round, when Shimon died, Rivka had the status of an Eshes Ach. She no longer has the status of an Eshes Ach after Levi is Miyabim her, Miyabim Rivka. V'chein darshina lahalon, a Gemara later on Daf Lamintes, v'lakcha. And the Gemara says, what is v'lakcha? Kevan shalakcha nases ki ishto l'chol davar. And what does that mean? Nases ki ishto l'chol davar? Lo liyavan bilvad hutra el l'kol ha'achim shahoyu b'chlal hazika. The zika for Yibum is uniform. It's one entity for all the achim. Zika means a zika for all the achim. What does that mean? If this ach that dies without children generates a zika to his brothers, then the zika is equal to all the brothers. Why? Because within the context of Levi, there is no difference between Reuven and any other brother. Reuven is not different. Why? Because when you look at Levi, Rivka is not a tzaras erva to Levi. I'm sorry, to vis-a-vis Reuven. So in other words, we now have a new bias of Zika with the death of Levi. So it's really fascinating. What the structure that Rav Shimshon is designing in front of our eyes is such that there's a Zika on the first round, and then we differentiate between Rivka's status vis-a-vis Reuven and Rivka's status vis-a-vis Levi. Vis-a-vis Reuven, she is a tzaras erva. Vis-a-vis Levi, she's not a tzaras erva. But once we get to a yibum subsequent to the first Nefila, we start from scratch with a brand new Zika. And we ask, what Zika is generated by the death of Levi? And now we are totally encompassed in a capsule. I mean, that is meaning today, right? In a locked capsule of Levi and the members of his household, his other brothers. And in that capsule, Rivka is not a tzaras erva. And this is derived from the possible lakcha, which means Kevin Shalokha Nases Ki Ishto L'chol Davar. Shimon Shkop is interpreting that to mean that a brand new Zika, replacing the original Zika from Shimon, is now generated by Levi's death, in which all the Achim are included in that Zika. And in that Zika, we look at the relationship between all the Achim and the wives of Levi that were left as widows after Levi's death. What is the relationship between these wives and the brothers in the household, and in relative to or as vis-a-vis Levi? As far as Levi's wives are concerned, that Zika is uniform to all the brothers, which basically I think in Balabatish terms, what Rav Shimshon was saying is that if Reuven is going to be Miyabim, the wife of Levi, he is sort of picking up that marriage relationship. He's stepping into the shoes of Levi. Levi Nebuch is gone without children, and now Reuven goes into his shoes and picks up that marriage relationship. And in the context of the marriage relationship to Rivka and Levi, there was no there was no erva whatsoever to Reuven other than Eishesach. Obviously, but the Torah was matter Eishesach Mokum Yoma. The Afshal Lechoret Tzoras Erva Niftera Mechalitza V'Yibum Li Oso Ach Shenesar Bo Adayin Ein B'Kach Hechrev Shelo Hoysa Lo Shum Zika Klapov Ki Tochen Shelo Pasra Torah B'Ptur L'Gamur Shel Erva Elak Oso Milis Yavim Lo. Reb Shimon is sort of deflecting a question that he self-imposes on himself. He's asking, wait a minute. Once she fell from Shimon to Reuven in the first round, she became an Eishes Ach to Reuven. How are we going to remove that Isser of Eishes Ach? Because Reuven cannot have a relationship with Rivka insofar as she is the wife of his brother Shimon. So the answer to that is that Rivka did have a Zika to Reuven with the death of Shimon. Just that the Torah tied his hands, meaning Reuven's hands, because of the status of Rivka as a Tzaras Erva. But there was a Zika of Yibum, and therefore when Levi dies, that Zika of Rivka that is generated by the death of Levi now, in a sense, picks up where the original Zika left off, and there was a barrier that tied the hands of Reuven around his back to be Makayim that Zika and implement Yibum, but that barrier was lifted now as a result of the fact that the Zika is now being permeated or generated by Levi. That's what I got from this Reb Shimon. And then in the next paragraph, he says, all this is in the Hava, meaning before we have Litzra. I'll leave it to Emes Lamaskana, he says, the Litzra is teaching us that we made a mistake, that when Rivka, the Tzara of Leah, was Ptura, she gets the status of an Erva, and that terminates the Zika. So it's not possible to create a replacement Zika with the death of Levi to, in a sense, pick up the original Zika, because the Torah completely removes that Zika, and therefore Rivka gets the status of an Eishes Ach vis-a-vis Reuven. And now she patas Hatzara when Levi married his second wife. Od Kosav Reb Shimon Shka, Mahalch Nosaf B'Yishuv Kusha Hanal, another answer to Rabbi Kivega's Kasha. Al Pia Mavur Lehalon, a Gemara Daf Yud Gimel and Beis. The Chol Yevamot she'af lulei mitzvahs yibum lo hayaba iser eishes ach ena nofeles klal liyibum. It means that there's a kind of a paradox here, in which case the Torah says that Yibum applies whenever there's an Iser Eishes Ach, and now the mitzvah of Yibum is, so to speak, meant to override Eishes Ach. Kol erva she'en ba sibas nefila klal eno poteres es tzarasa. Now he introduces a second principle. Not only is the mitzvah of Yibum depends upon the fact that it's coming to be matir, what otherwise, if not for Yibum, would have been an Yisrei Shesach. But in addition to that, if there would be another reason why this erva would not fall for Yibum, then she would not pater a tzara, because I wouldn't call her a tzara's erva unless the erva removes Yibum because of the erva. If there's another reason extraneous, additional to the erva that removes Yibum, then there was no nefil for Yibum, and she cannot therefore pater a tzara. So dafka erva b'makom mitzvah, Klomer sheyesh ba nefila liyibum, el shenifteres midin erba poteres esor lefize yesh lomar Shelule alitzor lo haisa tsara poteres es tsarasa b'nefila shnia, mishum she'ena nofeles klali b'me'ach hasheni, lefi she'ena. Wait, who's he talking about? Is he talking about the tsaras erva or the tsaras tsara? Let me just get this. They show me the lule alitzor lo haisa tsara. So he's talking about Rivka. So Rivka would not patter up Spritzel. Mishum she'ena nofeles klalimu me'ach hasheni lefi she'ena asura machmaso be'iser eches ach. Arei benkach nesra mishum eches ach machmas ha'ach harishon. I don't get it. Wait a minute. Let's say Ruvain is married to a woman and Shimon is married to a woman, and no relation whatsoever. Shimon dies and her wife falls b'yimo, and then Levi's b'yavim, but Levi dies. So I would assume in that case certainly there's yimo. If Ruvain wasn't b'yavim Shimon's wife on the first round, Levi will be b'yavim on the first round, then Ruvain will be b'yavim on the second round if the Levi dies. So why not apply the same logic? But Levi is not adding anything to the original Eser of Ashes Ach. She was anyway an Ashes Ach, Machmasach Rishon. What am I missing here? In the case where she wasn't in Erev, so it's the same identical Eser Ashes Ach. But here, we're going to split between Ruvain and Levi. We're going to say these are two different, that she, Rivka, in terms of generating a status of Ashes Ach, there are two different arayos, so two different chain erevas of Ashes Ach. One as a result of Shimon and one as a result of Levi. Asura machmas iser ashes ach. Isn't that always true in any case where there are a bunch of brothers? Oh, I think I understand what he's saying. Let me give it a shot. He's saying that the status of Rivka, even before she falls for Yibum through Levi to Reuven, is already that of an Erev of Ashes Ach, because she, Rivka, could not fall for Yibum to Reuven because she was a Tzaras Erva to Reuven. Right? That Shimon was married to Leah and to Rivka. Rivka's status is a Tzaras Erva. She doesn't fall for Yibum. Is Memela, her relationship as an Erva to Reuven is that of an Ashes Ach. Now, when Levi dies, Rivka does not gain, so to speak, obtain a second Erva status of Ashes Ach. She's already out of the picture because of the first Ashes Ach. So therefore, vis-a-vis Levi, Rivka doesn't even fall for Yibum to Reuven. Why? Because Levi's Ashes Ach, again with Reuven in the background, doesn't add anything to Rivka's already established status of an Ashes Ach Machmas, her status of Eitzaris Erva when Shimon died. Let me just see how that reflects the two principles that he establishes. First of all, he says that if, even without the mitzvah of Yibum, there would be Sorry. If there would not be an Iser Ashes Ach, then Yibum would not apply. Because Yibum only applies when there's an Iser Ashes Ach. I'm not sure why he needs that. Let's go on to the second principle. I thought the second principle is enough, is sufficient to clinch this answer to Rabbi Akiva's question. He says, Kol ervisha ein sibas nefila klal, eino poteres es soros dafka erva v'makom mitzvah, ama sheyesh ba nefila liyibam el shenteres in erva poteres soros. So in order to pater the tzor, you need a nefila of the yibam. And already it's clinched that this woman, Rivka, could not have a nefila yibum to Reuven as a result of Levi's death, because she's already an erva as a tzaras erva as a result of the first nefila of Shimon's death. So that the principle of nefila yibum, the mechanism of nefila yibum, which is contingent on the fact that the only erva that you're left with is the erva of Eishes Ach, but here is another erva of Eishes Ach, in the case of Tzaras erva, that is totally independent of and not generated by the death of Levi, because she's already an erva of Eishes Ach as a result of Shimon's death, because Shimon was married to Leah. So now the status of Rivka is that she would not fall for Yibam at all to Reuven, and therefore she could not infect Spritzel, the second wife, the Tzara of Rivka, because Rivka herself doesn't have an afil Yibam. And we've already established that if there's no nefila liyibum, you cannot pati yitzara. And we're establishing that there's no nefila liyibum of Rivka, the widow of Levi vis-a-vis Ruvain, because Rivka has already been established as an erva of Eishes Ach by virtue of her nefila rishona when Shimon died. So that erva situation called Eishes Ach between Rivka and Ruvain is already locked in stone, engraved in stone at the moment of Shimon's death. And the erva of Eishes Ach that is generated by Levi's death, by Levi, is not chal. It has no room to grab on because she's already an Eishes Ach by virtue of the first nefila, and therefore she could not fall for Reuven at all, and therefore she could not pater her place. It seems to me, I don't know, this is my intuition, that the second approach of Rav Shimon Shkop has nothing whatsoever to do with the first approach. The first approach was based on the fact that if not for the Gzeres HaKosuv, from which we derive the P'tur of Tzaras Tzara, we would have said that Levi creates a new entity and a brand new Zika that replaces the original Zika. And within the context of Levi's new Zika, Rivka has no status of a Tzaras Erva vis-a-vis Reuven, because she never was a Tzaras Erva as far as Levi is concerned. Levi married Rivka. Rivka is not a Tzaras Erva as far as Levi is concerned. If Levi creates a brand new bubble, that new capsule that we spoke about, Absula, of Zika, then she can now fall for Reuven, to Reuven. The second answer of Rabbi Shimon is totally different. He's saying now that what's engraved in stone is the erva status of Rivka vis-a-vis Reuven by virtue of Shimon's nefila, and therefore the erva isur of Ashes Levi, as far as Reuben is concerned, does not add anything. It doesn't generate an isur of erva of Ashes Ach to Levi. She's already an erva of Ashes Ach by virtue of Shimon to Reuven, and therefore there's no nefila of yibum. She can't possibly be considered an erva that would pater up Hatzor. And now we get to Rabbi Elchanan. Rabbi Elchanan answers, Kovetz Oros, she'ein erva poteres es tzorosa elim kein af hi atzma nifteres machmas din erva shema. Avol tzara lo niftera, and I'm going to add a few words, machmas din erva sheba, elam mishum shi tzaras erva. So this goes back to the first Rabbi Elchanan that we spoke about a few days ago. How do you understand the status of Mitzaras Erva? What is Rivka's status? Is she an expansion of Leah? That Leah, insofar as she's the sister of Rachel, is an Erva, and that Erva relationship now just expands, and we graft on to Leah a status of an Erva, even though she inherently is not an Erva. Or do we say no? That since she is the Tzaras Erva, she now gains her own independent status as an Erva. We spoke about Mishmash Nachla, if you remember. And Rabbi Elchanan saying that if not for the Pasuk, I would certainly assume that Rivka has no status as an Erva over here. She's just picking up, in the context of the Xeris HaKos with Tzaras Erva, the status of the original Erva, meaning of Leah. So when you have a borrowed status, you're just a mirror image of an erva. You don't have that position, that status of partnering up with Tzor. Now I read the Chazon Ish. I didn't understand how he is any different than Rabbi Elchanan. He writes, "Shemikema she'ein achisaron b'tzaras ha'erva atzma, ela sheman asa Torah miyibu mishum she'tzaras shel erva b'svara." And he quotes the Rashba, who says that Kol Isu Sheba Shedavar Acher Garm Lo Liyasu Liyom Ein Ba Tur Erev. Okay, that's, I think, to my mind, that's exactly what we saw in Rabbi Elchanan. Now, I started looking at the Birchas Shmuel here, number Vav, on the left column. Honestly, I wasn't able to get it. I still want to give it one more chance. Let's try it as a Chabura. And he quotes his Rebbe Reb Chaim, Misugyas Chalitza Muberes, Lalon, She'isur Eishes Ach, Eino Nechshav Ke'erva, Le'inyan P'tur Yibum. I mean, this is really radical. I mean, he's saying that this is the way I originally mistakenly understood the Mitzvah, but that was a mistake. I didn't have the original Mitzvah. That there's something in the Erev of Eishes Ach that makes it different, and it cannot pater from Yibum. Al Kenan Apotit Sorah. His Baru Hadvar B'Chidushay Reb Shmuel. Reb Shmuel was a Talmud of Reb Acher, who's in turn a Talmud of Reb Chaim. Shehine Masha Kol Erva Surah Be'Isur Kares Umashi P'tur Miyibum Shnei Dinim Chalukim. This is very profound. What does he say here in the footnote? He says, "Came of Alon Yudimon Beishav Makom She'ein Isur Eishes Lo Chala Klal Mitzvahs Yibum." In other words, I think what he's saying here to the my limited understanding is that on the contrary, the Iser Kares of Eishes Ach, paradoxically, is what sets up Yibum. He can't tell me that the Iser Eishes Ach could patter up Yibum. On the contrary, if she didn't have this Yevamot, the status of an Iser, if she didn't generate an Iser Eishes Ach, there would not be Yibum. You read that in the footnote? But Makom Shein Iser Eishes Ach lo chala klal mitzvahs Yibum. He can't tell me that the Iser Eishes Ach is what generates a p'tur of Yibum, when on the contrary, it's a precondition to the mitzvah of Yibum that there be an Iser Eishes Ach. To turn around and now say that the Erev Eishes Ach patters you from Yibum is self-contradictory, because on the contrary, it's after the Iser Eishes Ach that generates the mitzvah. That's a precondition for the mitzvah of Yibum. So we would know if there, in a scenario where there's no Iser Eishes Ach, there would not be Yibum. So the Iser Eishes Ach is not a poter of Yibum. On the contrary, it's the machayev of Yibum. So we must assume that there are two different dinim. One din is that there's such a thing as an Iser Kares with regard to the Erva. And then there's another din that the Erva patters up from Yibum. But you can't tell me that the Iser Kares is what removes Yibum, because on the contrary, it's the Iser Kares of Eishes Ach that generates Yibum. The Ervas Eishes Ach she'ein la banu, Ach shehi be'Iser Kares, we call them ein ba din erva linyan p'tur Yibum. So imagine the following scenario. Shimon dies and he has a son. Just 1 second. No, I jumped the gun a little bit. Right, okay. No, he's just repeating what he said before. Oh, wait a second. Ain ba. Wait, what's the word ba referring to? The Eras Eishes Ach. Ain ba did Everlinian P'turim. Okay, he's basically reiterating what he said before, that although Eishes Ach is an Iser Kares, that status of an Erva of Eishes Ach is not a shame Erva that patters you from Yibum. The shame Eishes Ach hi hasiba hamachayeves sayim. Oh, Baruch Hashem, we're on the right track. Valkein, gam im nifteres hayevamot be'ezo siba shehi. I guess he's referring to Rivka, who's a tsar of an Arab, I guess. Af shechozer ba din ervas Eishes Ach linyan Iser Kares mipokom ein ba Eishes Ach linyan p'tur Yibum. Ein bekocho liftar sorrow. So let's just think. Leah patters of Rivka as a tsaras erva, and now Rabbi Kiveger asks, once Rivka is outside of Yibum, then she becomes an erva of Eishes Ach, and now she should patter up Hatzara in the next nefilah when she's married to Levi together with another wife. Says Reb Chaim, wait a minute. On the contrary, the fact that she is an Eishes Ach and is an Iser Kares, I mean to say, the status of Rivka is that of an Eishes Ach. That's not enough to pater up Hatzara, because it's not the Iser Kares of Eishes Ach that pater a Yevamot. Adarabah, the Iser Erev of Eishes Ach is what generates the mitzvah of Yibum. So how would I ever know that the Tzaras Tzara is P'tur B'Yibum? Why? Because she's a Tzara to the Tzaras Erva, but the Tzaras Erva only has an Iser Kares. Now, I think you have to add the following. Mashenkein, all other arayos, like for example, achos ishto, there the shem erev itself does pater from you. So that what happens is that Leah is ptura miyibum because of the isakaris of achos ishto. That's as far as Leah is concerned. Now the Torah is b'chadesh that Rivka, the tzara of Leah, does not fall for yibum. But Rabbi Kivega's point that now Rivka becomes Ashes Achiv, and that Erev should pater up Rivka's tzara. That's not true, says Reb Chaim, because all you have in the case of Rivka is the Isur Karis of Ashes Achiv. And the Erev of Karis is not enough to pater Yibum, because on the contrary, the Erev of Ashes Ach is what generates the mitzvah of Yibum. So how would you figure out that a tzara is p'tura b'yibum? The only status of a tzara's erev vis-a-vis the tzara would be eshesach, and eshesach is not an erev which patents from yibum. On the contrary, the erev of eshesach is what generates yibum. Masha Enket, as far as Rivka as a tzara of Leah, that's a whole different concept. There, Leah has another erva other than eshesach that patents her from yibum. And the Torah was mechadish that Hatzara likewise to review. But that's not going to have an impact on Rivka in the next generation, because Rivka herself is only an Eshesach. That's the only ever she has. And Eshesach is not pater her from you. Wow. Honestly, if this is right, this is the most original answer to Kiveg. And it sounds like it's, how do you say, foolproof? Now, meaning Rivka, Benafila Rishona, the also Tzaras Erev, she was a Tzara to Leah. The after Memela Nesra B'Yisakari Shaleshesach. Mikomakom, Eino Nases Mishum Kach Ervas Eshes Ich Achle Inyan P'tur Yimum. Well, again, I don't think that's what Reb Chaim was saying. Not that Eino Nases Ervas Eshes Ach. What it means is that that Eshes Ach is not a poter of Yibum. I don't think the formulation here is precise. The Ein B'Kolcha Liftar Es Sarasa, meaning Sprinzel, the Sarah of Rivka of Levi. Lule Adrosha now, Ach Alib Diemes, meaning Lamaskana, Ba Halitzo Labdenu, Sheptur Tsaras Erva Benefila Rishona, Mafkia Mimena Din Yibum Lagamri. Shuv Choser Liftar Ba Ha'eshes Ach. Yidin Eshes Ach Shalom B'Makom Mitzvah. Rehi Erva Gemura Liftar Es Tsaras. The tour of Tsaras Erva removes the din of Yichud Lagamri. Why is that relevant? Choser Liftar Ba Eshes Ach. Yidin Eshes Ach Shalom B'Makom Mitzvah. Back for a second. Did he mention Eshes Ach Shalom B'Makom Mitzvah until this point? Did I miss that? Maybe it means Muberes. Anyway, he says the maskana lies, the key to unlock the maskana lies in this concept, this principle called Eshes Ach Shalom B'Makom Mitzvah. But I'm not exactly sure what that means. Let's say what we would have said without this, that the maskana is What is the maskana? You know, the Hamid is so strong. I don't know what the maskana is. Maskana is that even though all she has is the herb of H's, doesn't have an additional herb status. So why does she pater? This is what I would have said. Maybe that's what he means. That what the Torah is telling us now in the second round of Tzoras Tzara is that whenever you have a woman who is excluded from Yibum, Hat Tzara is likewise excluded from Yibum. Not because of the Erev of Eishes Ach. We've already proven that the Erev of Eishes Ach, on the contrary, is Machayev in Yibum. So what gives Rivka in the second round, when she's married to Levi together with Sprinzel, what gives her the status of a Tzoras Erva to pater of Sprinzel? And the answer is that once Rivka was bumped off, she was excluded, she was disqualified from Yibum, then halacha is that once there's a woman who's married to your late brother and she was disqualified from Yibum, she disqualifies her tzara with. It's just a technical halacha called tzoras tzara. Havi Ezri Kosav, Alpi Mashmur V'Ula Halon Daf Ches. You see how all the sugyas in Yevamot tie in together. So Lea Droshim Me'aleh, V'yinu L'meidim Behekesh Es Kol Arayas V'Eches Shem Shehi Putra L'Yibum V'yinu Matirim Es Kol Arayas V'Yibum Maksha Gemara Im Kain Afli Acher Shegilsa Torah Me'achos Icha Sheina V'Siyabemes Ma Raya L'Hakish Es Kol Arayas Elel Ule Osron V'lo L'Akishan Leishas Ach Ule Hatiron. Her answer is Shemina Ra'ui L'Akishan Liachos Isha Mishum Sheyesh Bahem Shnei Isurim Kamosa. Oh, very good. So just like the Torah says that there's no yibum to achos isha, because in addition to H's ach, there's another erva. If we add any other erva, that makes sense that it's like achos isha. And therefore, we're not going to say that any other erva is like H's ach, because we already saw in achos isha that once you add a piggyback erva, you don't patter up Eishes Ach. I'm saying there's no nafil for Yibum if there's an additional erv on top of Eishes Ach, and therefore all the 15 will qualify. V'lo Eishes Ach she'ein bo el Yisrael. Ikshur Atosis and Kain Tzoras Islandis v'Tzoras Eishes Ach shelo hoya be'olamo is yesh lahakish li Eishes Ach ula tiron shafahem ein elo isur echad shel Eishes Ach. I don't understand. Tzoras Islandis. It's not a Tzoras Arab. Let's be matin. Doesn't the Mishnah say that a Tzoras Island is no fellas evil? Let's see. That's what I thought. Did I wake up on the wrong side today? V'kulan of Mesu on Daf Beis Amid Beis. Shenimsu Island is Tzoras Mutaros. So what is the kasha now that he's asking? You can Tzoras Island is Yesh lahakish seishes sachul atiron. Yeah, Tzoras Island says explicit in the Mishnah she's muteris. Not sure what he means by Tzoras Islands. Mitzoras Eishes Ach Shelo Hoye Ba'olamo. So let's say, for example, Levi is born before Shimon. Levi is born after Shimon dies. So there's no Yibum relationship between Levi's almana and, between Shimon's almana and Levi, correct? Because Levi was born after Shimon died. Now Levi gets married, and he marries two wives. If Levi dies, his wife doesn't fall for Yibum to Shimon, but she will fall for Yibum to another brother that overlapped with him. Let's call it, we'll call it Ruvain. Again, let's see. Therefore, if Levi is married to two wives, just like Hikshu Atov, Mem, where is it? Mem Ches. Is that a Mem Ches? Shom. I guess Shom means Daf Ches. Let's see if I'm right. Shom Dibur Maschil Isure. Let's see on Daf Ches is this Tosus Dibur Maschil Isure. No, you mistake here. Oh, it's a hey. Hey, let's see. Hey, Dibur Maschil Isure. What am I? I'm just missing something. Something got lost here. Sorry. It says the Hikshu Atosis. That's Memches. Sham. Dibra Masil Isure. I hate the word Sham. I don't know who invented it. In English, it's called Ibu. Drives me nuts. Maybe it's Lamed Beis. Do you have Lamed Beis? I don't have Lamed Beis because I have the first volume. Is there a Tosam Lamed Beis Dibra Masil Isure? No. You didn't find it by now.
Right.
What?
Which one?
I say, if you have Daf Lamed Beis, right. Is there a Tosas Dibra Maskil Isure? You didn't find it by now, and it doesn't exist. So what does Sham mean? Crazy. I don't know what they're. Well, I'm just gonna fast forward as if I understand. The Tirtzu Shemiachar Sha'ailan Esveishis Ach Shalohaisa Bolama Asuros Af Tzorosan Asura. V'hine Lusvaras Hatosus Ein Litzara Liftar Tzorosa Mishum Eishis Ach Shari Ein Kan Ela Isur Erva Echa Shapi Yesh Lakisha L'chol Eishis Ach Atir Liyim Me'acher Me'at Yesh Af Tiritz Atosis Eno Misvara Elekenu Gakla Li'achar Halitzor Avalule Droshazu Lo Yinu Potrim Tsara Im Ein Ba Ela Isur Echad Mitam Zeh Gam Tsara Lo Haisa Poteres Es Tsaras. Actually, Achar Shegilsa Torah, Sora Poteret. This is very similar to Reb Chaim. You know what he's saying? The halacha of erva that patis from yibum is only when there's an additional erva on top of HSA. In the case of tzaras erva, as Rabbi Kivega points out, there's an erva of HSA, but there's no additional erva. So therefore, how could she possibly pater up her tzara? You're going to tell me because she has the status of an HSA? Well, we derive the din of the patur of tzaras erva from achos isha, which means that there's an additional erva on top of HSA. And here is where Reb Chaim comes to the fore, and he says on the contrary, Ishis is not a siba poteris, it's a siba mechayevet. Although I can't tell you what the nitty-gritty details are because he quotes a Tosfos which I don't find, and I don't know enough about Saras Islands. But nevertheless, I think I got the basic structure. And in my mind, it's a repeat of what we had from Reb Chaim. Now, how many minutes do we have? Can you give me an idea? Because I'm not sure if we should start something new. I had two things on my agenda, two items. One is Tosas Bito on Daf Beis and Aleph. And the other, which I know it's a project, I don't know if we'll get through it, is Tosas Beis and Beis Dira Masal Ocean into islands.
It's 10:37.
Already 10:37. So I think we'll stop here. I'll take this opportunity to thank you and wish you a good Shabbos. I'm happy that we got through the Netziv finally. Mm-hmm. And in addition to the Netziv, we have a whole bunch of different answers here. We have two gigantic answers in Reb Shimon Shkab and a very simple, straightforward answer in Reb Elchanan. And what I think is the most brilliant answer is Reb Chaim. I mean, that really steals the show. I mean, once you have Reb Chaim, you wonder what the maskana is. Reb Chaim gives you such a stark ahavim that you can't tell me that Soras Erva is going to pata hot Sora because of the Erva of Eishes Ach, which is the basic premise of Rabbi Vega, because Eishes Ach is the only Erva that doesn't pata from Yibum. On the contrary, Eishes Ach is the Erva that generates Yibum. And the halacha of a patur of an Erva is not because of the Iser Kares that's involved, but rather because of the separate patur of Yibum and Erva. So it's not a reflection or a result of the Sakaris of Erva, because on the contrary, the Sakaris of Eishes Ach is the precondition to Yibum. And the mix of Yibum applies not only as a result of Eishes Ach, but only when there's an Eishes Ach. I mean, that to me is like the strongest argument I can imagine. I mean, the Netziv is much more sophisticated, that we derive the P'tur of Tzara from Achos Ishto, and Achos Ishto is an erva which you can never remove actively through a get. Whereas in the case of Tzaras erva, if he would divorce Leah, if Shimon would have divorced Leah, he would remove the status of Tzaras erva from Rivka, and that's very simple. And Rabbi Elchanan is saying that a Tzaras erva is not asur mitzad atzmo, only asur mitzad the original erva, and the din of a p'tur tzara only applies when you have an erva whose begufa is inherently an erva. Then we have the two answers of Reb Shimon, which are very sophisticated, where the zika to Levi somehow, removes the entire zika rishona of the nefila, or in his second mahalach, as we said, that she has to be an eishes each machmas ha'achar rishon, not machmas ha'achar sheni. Okay then. So next week we'll start with either Tosas Bito or Tosas Islanders, and then we're going to try to plow weiter in the Gemara on Daf Beis Amud. Okay then. All right. Have a good shot.
What's the status of after you hear?
Is there any issue here of erva, you mean, or what?
No. But I mean, there's supposed to be a connection to
the achames, to the Yavam, to the deceased brother, the late brother. Does it have any halachic? I don't think so. I think it's all metaphysical.
Because
I mean, there is an issue, I don't know halacha l'maisa about what name you should give the baby. You know, the first baby that's born should get the name.
Yeah.
Because it says lahakim shem li'achim. I don't even think we accept that. But is there any halachic ramifications to the fact that the Torah wants to retain the zera and continue evolution? Let's think about it. So Levi is Miyabim, the wife of Shimon.
Yeah.
And you want to say that? Well, I think an ach comes even before a wife. I don't know. I have to know the laws of Yerusha. But you're saying, Jeff, that if I don't know the mitzvahs yet, but if the son of Levi, we'll call him Yaakov, if this Yaakov would maintain an inheritance through his father, through his grandfather Shimon, then Levi, the father of Yaakov, would have rights. And since he's the son of Yaakov, now the grandson is Nikra al-Shem, his father. I don't know. Maybe if we were greater B'kiyim in the laws of
because then if Levi dies and she falls to Reuben, he's got like two brothers that he's responsible for, but one of those brothers' wife is married to his sister.
Right, sister to his wife. Right.
So I mean it's.
You want to know that in the Hamavina, let's say before the tour of Torah, would Reuven, when he's B'yavim Rivka and has a child, would that child be Nikra al-Shem Levi or even al-Shem al-Shem Shimon? You know, maybe we go back a generation.
And then
if there are halachic ramifications, Jeff, in Yerusha, then your question becomes quite relevant. But I think that the discussion that I just raised is only relevant in the Hamavina. At the end of the day, Reuven cannot be B'yavim Rivka.